Okay. Well, thank you for coming. My name is Don DeCristofaro. I'm from Quincy, Mass. And I am the founder of a group called the Greater Boston Paranormal Associates. This is our logo. I think you probably see it on my back as well. Um, the logo is symbolic. The 139 at the top is an homage to USS Salem in Quincy, which is CA-139. That's where our office is. That's where we do most of our work. And our motto on the bottom, the dead live, which is what we try to make happen as often as we can, is on the bottom there. Our team is unique, and there are, since the inception of like ghost hunters on television, there are thousands of teams like mine all over the country. I think ours is somewhat unique in that, most of us are believers in the paranormal, but we have a couple of people that are major league skeptics. The co-founder of my group, if these three empty chairs were to raise up to the ceiling and fly across the room, Pat would say, "Well, yeah, but it's an old building and it's kind of settling, and I think the air conditioning's on, so that might have." It's really more, you're laughing, but it's more infuriating than it is funny, to be completely honest. But and we have a number of sensitives, people who have different degrees of abilities and to different levels of ability. And while those things make us unique, they also, I think, put us in a great position to approach the things we do from virtually every angle. You know what I mean? We don't walk into a location knowing that there's something going on there, because we don't know whether there's anything going on there. But by the same token, we don't walk in saying, since it doesn't exist, it can't possibly be happening. And we have sensitives, as I said, who walk into locations and immediately have an ability to tell us where we need to look and what we need to look at. And sometimes they're on the money, sometimes not so much, but that's cool as well. But the other thing about our approach, and I don't know whether any of you guys watch the TV shows, the ghost TV shows. You certainly don't learn anything if you do. But many of them, their spiel kind of revolves around yelling and screaming. It's a method called provoking, and a lot of people think of it as the best way to get activity. Um, we don't do that. And when we have events aboard the ship, in particular, I make it clear to people who come aboard that if we catch them doing anything along those lines, the ghosts are the least of their problem. I'm the one they're going to have to deal with, because the entities that are aboard the ship, and not just aboard the ship, but all the entities we deal with, they're the same people they were before they went to the other side, and they deserve to be treated with the same respect as they would have if you were looking them in the face. And we don't believe that yelling and screaming at them is the way to go. They're not trained SEALs. They're not going to bark on command. They're going to do what they want to do when they want to do it. And I think the activity we get aboard the ship has proven out that methodology is really the way to go. The other thing is, we travel a lot together as a gang. We have a lot of fun everywhere we go. And I think we're all kind of the same mind that when we're not having fun anymore, that's pretty much the end of it. What the hell's the point once we get to that point? And as you can see, we are a very fun group. That's not us. So this is us, and we are standing on the porch of a house known as the Sally House in Atchison, Kansas. Most people who do what we do would say that it is the most haunted house in America. It has a very, very bad history. And I can tell you right now, clearly this picture is before we spent the night. We were much more somber in the morning. This is probably the only place I've ever been that absolutely did not want us there, and made it crystal clear to us throughout the night that it didn't want us there. My podcast partner, Sandra Morgan, at one point we were doing what's called an Esty session, which is where you have one person in a room alone, and they have an instrument called a spirit box, which I'll show you later. and they have headphones on, noise-canceling headphones, so all they can hear is the spirit box. And there are people in another room asking questions, and the idea is to see if this person, without hearing the questions, is hearing answers on the spirit box. And a number of times the spirit box said, Sandra dies tonight. You notice I'm laughing now. It wasn't quite as funny at the time. Sandra still doesn't think it was funny for some reason. Some reason I can't really understand. So you may have seen us. We've been on television quite a bit. We've been on the Discovery Channel, a number of their shows. Chronicle on Channel 5 has done us a couple of times. CBS Boston, which I believe is Channel 4, has done us a couple of times. We've done quite a bit of radio, WBZ and WATD. I'm very friendly with one of the original Ghost Hunters guys, Jason Hawes, and I often tell him that he's been on TV for 20-something years on the Travel Channel, Sci-Fi, and the Discovery Channel, and I tell him that in one afternoon we had a bigger audience than he's had through all his 20 years of television combined, because last year ESPN called me and said that the head football coach at UConn, pictured here, Jim Mara, the house he lived in on campus was haunted, and they would like us to come down and do a little mini investigation. So we went down on a Friday night. We spent about 4 hours there, and then a couple of weeks later, we were on ESPN's College Game Day the Saturday before Halloween. And I'm pretty sure that's a bigger audience than Ghost Hunters gets on the Travel Channel. I could be wrong. So I brought a little bit of our equipment. I'm going to show it to you, but before we do that, there are a couple of things I want to tell you. One is that you're going to hear me, as we get into the things we do aboard the ship, you're going to hear me use the word know, K-N-O-W, as in we know this or we know that. And I want to make it clear to you that in our business, there is no knowing anything. There's no way for us to know who we're talking to. But when I use the word know, and you'll see some evidence of this, what I mean is that I think we've done the kind of due diligence that it takes to talk about things with a very high degree of confidence. That I think we've done the work that it takes for us to say, we know this, and while technically that may not be the case, we got a pretty good idea that what we're saying is accurate. And again, I'll show you how we get to what I'm talking about. The other thing I want to say is that a lot of the equipment we use is based on electromagnetic fields. And I'm embarrassed to say that if you were to ask 100 ghost hunters what an electromagnetic field is, you'd get about 98 different answers, and 94 of them would be completely wrong. So since we're going to be talking about it, very briefly, it's a field that surrounds and interacts with anything that has an electric charge or is moving. In other words, friction, static electricity, these are the things that create an electromagnetic field. Just in the name, you can see it's got an electric component and a magnetic component. It transmits primarily as a light wave. EMF can vary in strength and frequency. The word spectrum is used for pretty much everything nowadays, and it's measured on the electromagnetic spectrum. All living organisms produce an EMF because of the electrical activity in their cells, primarily their brains. And some of the instruments we use will detect that. For the most part, they're not quite sensitive enough to detect our electromagnetic fields. When we go to a location, this is for electromagnetic fields and also temperatures, we do what's called backgrounding. When we go to a location we've never been to, we go through the whole location with an electromagnetic field detector and usually with a laser thermometer to make sure that we pick up any anomalies that may be present in the location without us trying to find anything. In other words, when we go to a room later on, if we get an electromagnetic spike, we want to know that there's wiring in the wall, or there's a circuit breaker in the panel, in the closet, or something along those lines, so that we're not wasting our time, and also so that we're not excited about evidence that really doesn't exist. Okay? So again, if you've ever watched any of the shows, you know that this is a device called a K2 meter. It was the original go-to. Every ghost hunter I know, this was probably their first piece of equipment. I know it was my first piece of equipment. It is an electromagnetic field detector. It's the same thing every electrician in the world carries in his toolbox. The difference is, lights. Everybody loves the lights. The new ones actually make a noise, okay? But it is an electromagnetic field detector. That's all it is. And as you can see, depending on the strength of the field, you can see that the lights go to varying degrees. Now, what happens in the paranormal field is, at some point, the people who make K2 meters, they realize they've sold pretty much all the K2 meters they're going to sell. So they need to come up with something more expensive, something newer. This is called a paralight. It is basically a much more expensive K2 meter. K2 meters run about $60. This runs about $250. But as you can see, it does the same thing, right? I mean, it just spikes. The good thing about these is these are not sensitive at all. So that when we're in a location, you're going to see a video in a few minutes where one of these is spiking. And again, no one thing tells you for sure what's happening, but when one of these goes off, you got a pretty good idea that there's something going on, and you want to spend a little more time there checking it out, because like I said, it's not very sensitive at all, and when it spikes, that piques our interest. The new go-to piece of equipment in what we do is called a REM pod. Good and bad. It makes a lot of noise, which is a good thing. The bad thing is it is sensitive enough to pick up a human's electromagnetic field. So you really have to be careful when one of these goes off and you say, oh boy, something's happening. What we do on the ship is, and the reason I think we use these pretty effectively is, in a lot of cases, and you take a card later, it's got all our social media on the back, you'll see a number of videos where we're in a large room and there'll be 5 of these all going off in unison in response to questions. And in those cases, we got a pretty good idea there's something real going on. But using one of these alone, as I said, it's, The other good thing is a REM pod emits its own electromagnetic field. So that not only does it detect something that's external, it also detects a delta between what it's emitting and something that's external. So it's a little more sensitive in that regard as well. This is called a puck or a static pod. I kind of like it because what this does is measure static electricity. And one of the reasons I like it is, unlike a lot of the things we do that are kind of neat but not really explainable, the thought process here is really, really simple. And that is that anything that moves creates friction. Anything that creates friction creates static electricity. And that an entity coming or going into our plane or passing through the atmosphere next to this device will create static electricity and it will go off. It's pretty good. I mean, we use it quite a bit, and usually this is the first indicator we have that there may be something going on in a room. It's directional. The lights are all different colors, and it's directional, so theoretically it tells you what's where in the room as well. This is what I was talking about earlier. This is a spirit box. And what it is a radio scanner. But instead of focusing on one frequency, it scans. You can set it to AM or FM or both. You can set the scan speed. You can set the frequency, a range of frequencies. And the thought process here is kind of interesting too. I told you about the SD session and how that works. The thought process here is that in a lot of cases, entities that we deal with aren't strong enough to manifest on their own. And much like an artist, they need a palette or they need a medium. And that the static here produced by this device is the medium on which they paint. And hence, it gives them the ability or the strength to manifest audibly. I'm not sure I buy that entirely. To me, this is one of those devices, and we have a couple of others that are audible in terms of spitting out words. To me, if a device spits out 100 words, one of them is going to make people go ooh and ah. But it's a numbers game. You know what I mean? It doesn't really mean a whole lot to me. The other thing about these is I like it quiet. You can't hear a goddamn thing when these things are going. It's kind of ridiculous. Yeah. My preference in terms of equipment is old school equipment. These are my dowsing rods. I believe, unlike this stuff, which is all electronic and detects entities theoretically through electronic means, I believe this is all my energy. That's why, you see this beat up wooden case. This is my pendulum. This is my equipment. Nobody has ever used these sticks but me. And I believe it's because it's my energy that makes it happen. And as silly as it may sound, I truly believe that the reason these work so well is because when I'm trying to speak to an entity, using these, they can feel that I'm giving them a little bit of myself. And in response, they're a little bit more willing to give me a little bit of them back. Is there any history in this building? Does anybody think there's anything going on in this building? Yeah? All right. As you can see, I'm not touching them, right? They're in this like a sleeve. So I'm not touching the stick itself. If there's anybody in this room that would like to have a conversation, could you please point the sticks directly away from me? There you go. All right. We're going to have a conversation. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. If the answer to the question is yes, how are you going to show me that the answer is yes? You're going to cross the sticks. Okay. If the answer is no, I think I know the answer, but why don't you show me how you're going to tell me that the answer is no? All right. Okay. Do you reside here in the library all the time? Are you attached to somebody in this room? Did I bring you with me? You are Robert. All right, Robert, we'll talk later. Just everybody's seeing you across the sticks. Can you show me where you are in the room, please? Okay. All right, thank you. We're going to be on the ship tonight. Will you be there? All right, I'll talk to you then. Goodbye, Robert. That's the way these work. Robert, I'll tell you about Robert. Robert is a radium and master chief aboard Salem who tends to follow me home a lot of the time. You have cats? Anybody have cats? Do you know what this is? This is a cat ball. I've been doing this for 20 years, and you would not believe the charge I get when one of these damn things goes off. It's kind of silly, but I love them because, as I said earlier, with all this stuff, there are a lot of reasons why this stuff goes off. You know what I mean? When a REM pod goes off, when it's a bunch of them, okay, that's cool. But when one of them goes off, there's a number of reasons why it could be going off. And it takes a little bit of work to figure out whether it's something we're interested in or it's a wiring thing, but not these bad boys. If this goes off, something touched it. That's the only way these can go off. And I have a couple of pretty good videos from the ship of cat balls going off that are pretty neat. So what I was asked to come here today to talk about was primarily the Salem. Salem is a heavy cruiser. She is the only heavy cruiser left afloat. She had two sister ships, the Des Moines and the Newport News, both of which were in service longer than her, but both of which are now razor blades or some other useful steel. She was in service a very, very short period of time, 10 years, 49 to 59, which is a really short period of time for a Navy ship, especially a ship this big. But I think it was just a matter of timing. You know, come 1959, the Americans and the Russians were building submarines like they were going out of style, and Salem just wasn't built for that war. She was built to slug it out with other ships like Salem, and they hadn't recommissioned the battleships, so there were no other ships like Salem. So she basically just outlived her usefulness. I tell everybody I talk to that if there is another naval ship anywhere on Earth that never saw any combat but saw as much death as Salem saw, I would like to hear about it, because I don't think it exists. She spent the majority of her time in the Mediterranean, and in 1953 there was a very bad earthquake on one of the Ionian Islands off the coast of Greece. And because she was there, she was, for all intent and purposes, the hospital. The estimate is about 1,700 people brought aboard for treatment while she was there. Women, children, men, and a couple of animals, actually. There were about 10 babies born on the ship during that period. She was only there for about 3.5 days. You know, she wasn't built for that kind of mission. She didn't have the kind of medical supplies or food or really even fresh water to sustain that mission for any period of time. So she was a stopgap. She was only there about 3.5 days. The day she got back to Boston, she was at the East Boston Naval Shipyard, and USS Lady, which was a light aircraft carrier, had a catapult explosion. And 11 guys from Lady were brought aboard Salem for treatment. 6 of those guys died in the hospital of Salem. 1956, on the way back to the Med, she was steaming with a destroyer called John R. Pierce. My understanding is that Pierce was doing anti-aircraft drills, and for some reason they halted the drill, and when they started it again, they loaded a gun that had already been loaded. When they fired it, obviously the mount exploded. 1 guy was killed outright. 7 guys were brought aboard Salem for treatment, and 4 of those guys died aboard the ship. So between those incidents and 3 documented deaths aboard the ship, crew accidents, we think the death toll aboard the ship is probably about 100. You know, I think during the earthquake, they were so interested in getting people aboard and treated and off, I don't think they worried too much about counting them. So it's an estimate, but we think it's in the neighborhood of 100 people. And we talk to a lot of those people still. When we first came aboard the ship, and I've been aboard the ship now a little over 15 years, we primarily talked to Greek civilians, or people we thought were Greek civilians. We talked to a young man named Nico. We talked to him all the time, mostly with sticks. And it was great to talk to him. He always was very quick to come forward and speak to us, but you always felt awful afterwards, because here was this young guy who was talking about looking for his family. So that by the time you finished your conversation, you felt kind of empty, because there was nothing you could do for this guy. Nico is gone now, or at least we don't talk to him anymore, and I've chosen to believe that's because he found his family and they all moved on together. Whether that's the truth or not, I don't know, but that's what I've chosen to believe, and I'm going to stick with it. There's a 7-year-old girl named Lucy. Her and her parents are both aboard, are all 3 aboard, I should say. They all died during the earthquake. They're the reason I say we thought Greek civilians, because as it turns out, Lucy and her parents are Italian. They were living in Greece, but they're Italian. It's gotten to be kind of a running joke. We speak to Lucy with instruments. We speak to her mother with dowsing rods. And it's become a little bit of a joke that every time we're speaking to them and I ask the mother, is your husband here? She always says yes. And then I say, well, can I speak to him? And she always says no. And I tell her it's kind of like my house. There used to be a lot of kids aboard the ship. down in one of the berthing areas. And the kids down in the berthing area are one of the ways that we started looking into the relationships between the entities. When the kids were down in the berthing area, there was a man in the third mess, which is right above the berthing area, that we didn't really know much about. We do now, but we didn't at the time. We just knew him as the angry man back aft. He was a guy who was back there who seemed to be angry all the time. We had a medium aboard who, when I was talking about him, we were leaving the room. She walked by me and she said, "Well, thank you for not using the language he uses." And she kept walking. And there's a dog aboard that we have a lot of audio of. Nobody's ever seen him, but we have a lot of audio. And the dog used to be down with the kids. And what we started to wonder at that point was whether or not that angry guy was above, the kids were down below, and the dog was down with the kids because the dog was worried about that angry guy and what he would do if he went downstairs where the kids were. As it turns out, that guy is no longer an angry guy, and I'll talk about him in a minute too. But in any event, that's what kind of got us moving in the direction of how do these entities deal with each other? How do they talk to each other? Or do they talk to each other? What kind of information do they exchange? How well do they know each other? So, as I said, Lucy and her parents are still aboard. The kids are still there, but they don't come forward very often. The people we're talking about aboard Salem today are the crew. And while I said the thing with the dowsing rods and the personal energy sounded silly, this is going to sound even sillier, probably. 3 years ago, there's another guy in my crew. His name is Lou Calcagni. Lou and I are Navy. Three years ago in the early spring, right at the beginning of the season, Lou had a friend. His name is, we call him Laz. Frank Lazowski, his name is. Laz's daughter died of cancer. He was divorced. And when his daughter died of cancer, he was alone. He decided that was the end of that, and he took his own life. That night, Laz came to the ship and said goodbye to Lou. And I am here to tell you, it was friggin' gut-wrenching to watch. And I almost say I can only imagine, but the truth is I don't have to imagine. Because it was only 2 weeks later that a guy named Jim Duffy, who I served with for many, many years, passed away down in Philadelphia. And that night, Duff came and said goodbye to me on the ship. And Duff and Laz are still on the ship quite a bit. And the silly part, or what I think may sound silly, is what I believe happened is Duff and Laz came to the ship, and I believe they told the guys in the crew that Lou and I were Navy and that we understood their stories, that we knew what it was like to be at sea and to be away from your family for months. We knew what their lives were like. We knew what they went through. We knew how difficult it could be, and that their stories would interest us and we would understand. We had the same vocabulary. They didn't have to mince words with us, and that they could talk to us. And the reason I believe that to be the case is that shortly after that last time when Duff first came to see me, the activity aboard Salem exploded. And these are the guys we speak to aboard Salem on a regular basis. We have a public investigation tonight, and I guarantee you we will speak to at least 3 of those guys tonight. Radium and Master Chief Robert Jacoby is the guy that you just saw me talk to a minute ago. The guy back aft, the angry sailor, is Chief George Parker. We call him the Chief. He doesn't like to be called by his name. As I said, I've spoken to him for 15 years, and we just learned his name about 3 years ago. But he doesn't want to be called George or Chief Parker. He's the Chief. I believe the Chief is a great example of when I was in the service, when you're in the Air Force, you knew guys that joined the service, they came from nothing. They came from terrible backgrounds, terrible families. The service was their escape from that. And when they got out, that's what they went back to. And I believe the chief is one of those guys. And I believe when he passed, he decided to come back to the one place where he was happy, the one place that he considered home. The crew was the only group he ever considered his family. And I believe that's why the chief is aboard Salem. He is the guardian of the ship. You come aboard Salem and act the fool, the chief is who you will deal with. He has been known to push people, scratch people. He's pulled my hair on more times than I could even count. And the truth of the matter is he F-bombs me on a regular basis. Yeah. But the best example, and I'm going to get there, where you see verified in red, that's because, and here's the word, we know that's the guy. We know who he is. We know when he was aboard the ship. We have pictures of him aboard the ship. It's happening all the time. You saw the whiteboards in my office. These are the walls. Because every weekend there's something that we write on the wall because we don't want to forget, because it may happen again and it's going to lead us someplace and we want to remember what's taken place. Some of it's very, very random and never happens again. A few weeks ago, I spoke to a gunner's mate first class who said he was from the Pierce, who came aboard the ship to investigate the explosion. Never spoke to him again. We wrote it down because he may come back, but we don't know. Up in the wheelhouse of the ship, there's a quartermaster second class, a black sailor named Steve. I think we think now it's Andrew. He's very sad, very morose all the time. What we believe is that he had some kind of an issue with a woman. We think maybe a chief petty officer's wife. And he got himself in trouble, and he's always very, very depressed aboard the ship. The top one is my favorite. There's a man named Joshua Franklin, who was a lieutenant commander, an engineering officer aboard Salem in 1956 and 55 and 56. Joshua is not aboard the ship. He was only aboard the ship in life. His sister Allison, however, came aboard the ship looking for him. She came through a portal, and she couldn't find her way back. We speak to her down in the berthing area primarily, and she's hilarious. We have a guy by the name of, well, I won't bother saying his name. We have a guy in our group who's on the way out, actually. And whenever we deal with a voice instrument, an obelisk, or the spirit box, whenever this man speaks, or whenever his name is mentioned, Allison says, jerk. Every single time. I'm talking about 5, 6, 7 times. Every single time this guy speaks, she says jerk. So that proves that she's not only strong enough to manifest, she's also really intuitive because he's kind of a jerk. The interesting thing about Allison is she says now that she's found her way off the ship, but she's not interested in leaving. She's met a Marine gunnery sergeant who stands guard at the brig most of the time. We're fighting about his name. I think it's Patrick. Some of the folks think it's Peter. And she seems to have started some kind of a relationship with this gunnery sergeant. They're together in the berthing area a lot of the time. Once in a great while, she's down by the brig with him. That's where we usually talk to him. The wonderful thing about this guy is this. As I said, I've been on the ship 15 years, and back in the day, we have a computer that does it now, but back in the day, the only way to do the lights on the ship was to walk the length of the ship, turning them on and turning them off manually in each compartment as you went. The only time I was ever uncomfortable on the ship was when it got to be 2:30 in the morning, everybody was gone, we had turned on the lights to make sure we could find everybody, and once everybody had left, I would be all by myself, and I would have to walk down one side and back up the other, shutting off the lights as I went. And I can honestly say that's the only time I was ever really uncomfortable. But one of the things that made it kind of neat was that whenever I walked down the passageway, I always felt and occasionally heard somebody walking parallel to me in the other passageway. Always felt him, and occasionally would hear footsteps. Um, so last season, we had some guys aboard the ship filming a TV segment. And it was kind of interesting because they used different methods everywhere they went. But in any event, when they were down in the brig, they had a medium with them. And the production assistant came up to my office and got me and said, they need to talk to you. And when I got down there, she said, why are there Marines on the ship? And I said, well, a ship this size has a Marine contingent. I don't know how big, not a platoon, maybe 20 guys. And she said, okay, because there's a Marine down here, and he told me to tell you something. And I said, what is that? And she told me, he told her to tell me not to worry because he was the one that walks with me. Now, I hadn't told anybody that. I hadn't even told my gang that. That was my little thing. I kind of liked it. And in fact, when she told me that, she said, does that mean anything to you? Initially, I said no. But then I said, yeah, it does. And I told her that story, and she said, well, he says he loves to walk with you because you're the only one that loves the ship the way he does. So I said to her, well, you could tell him he doesn't have to walk on the other side of the ship. He can walk with me. I'd be more than happy to have him walk with me. But he's there, and we talk to him on a regular basis. We had a great conversation with him in the brig just last weekend. So this is just an example. They pop up all the time. A lot of times I think they see us doing what we're doing, and they kind of pop up and just say, hey, I've got a story. I've got a story too. And sometimes we hear them again, sometimes we don't. So how we got here in terms of these guys, and I put this here because Frank O'Brien is the best example of how we do what we do aboard Salem. Initially, we're talking about standard paranormal investigation stuff. In this case, we go in the hospital, we have instruments, we're talking to somebody. We've got a pretty good idea that we're talking to somebody. We have instruments going off in response to questions. They're only yes and no questions. But we have instruments going off in response. The timing is such that it gives us an idea that we're talking to somebody. Using yes and no questions, we know he's a man, we know he's a sailor, we know he's from the Salem. We get what years he was aboard the ship by asking, were you aboard the ship before 1955? And he says, no, okay, 55, 56. So we figure out when he's aboard the ship. And we do that using trial and error stuff, basically. The sensitives we have on our team, I talked about Sandra Morgan earlier. One day, Sandra said to me, hey, the guy in the hospital, his name is Frank. She said his real name is Francis, but he thinks that's effeminate. He likes to be called Frank. Okay. So the way we do that is we'll go in the hospital now and we'll say, we think, and this is one of those things I remember like yesterday. I think we know who you are. And everything in the room went crazy. Every instrument we had just went berserk. It was like this guy was just thrilled beyond belief that we knew who he was. And I said, we know now your name begins with an F. And everything lit up, and I said, we know now your name is Fred. And you could literally feel the disappointment in the room. But, that's one of the ways that we use to get an idea whether or not we're barking up the right tree. So then I say, no, you got me. We know that your name is Frank. And everything lights up. Another sensitive told us that Frank's name was O'Brien. So now we know. No. We talk to him and we decide Frank O'Brien is his name. That's when the research mode kicks in. I'm going to go back to this slide, but when a ship like Salem goes on a long deployment, when they get back, they issue what's called a cruise book. It's kind of like a high school yearbook for that particular deployment. And as you can see, they're one from every year. This one here is the 1955. That's the 1956 cruise book. We have all the cruise books. And it's frustrating because they're all different. But most of them, in the back of the book, most of them have a straight alphabetical listing of the crew. So once we get an idea that this guy's name is Frank O'Brien, we go to the cruise books for the years he was aboard. And sure enough, we find Machinist Mate 3rd Class Frank O'Brien. Now we go to the hospital and we do the same thing we did before, except, we know that you were a quartermaster. And he says no. And we get to machinist mate. So that's what, like I said, when you see verified, this is what we've done. With Frank, we've had his family aboard. His daughter considers herself something of a psychic. And she said she was very frustrated trying to talk to her father because there were so many people trying to talk to her that she was struggling to hear him talk. But she came aboard and had a nice conversation with her father. His son David came aboard. His son Frank is passed on, but David came aboard and had a conversation with his father as well. One of the things about Frank is when we first started talking to him, as I said, he was in the hospital. And he was in using the sticks, and where are you? He was standing by when you walk into the hospital. He was standing right here to your left. On the other side of this little aisle, on the bottom bunk, the first bunk on the right, there was a man named Ralph Malott, gunner's mate, third class Ralph Malott. Ralph was not from Salem. Ralph was from the John R. Pierce. Ralph was one of the guys that came aboard from the Pierce and died in the hospital aboard Salem. What we didn't understand was why Frank was right there where Malott was. So again, research and research and research. I found Ralph Malott's obituary on newspapers.com. Ralph Malott and Frank O'Brien graduated together from Wilmington, North Carolina High School. We think they knew each other before the Navy. And when Malott was hurt aboard Pierce and came to Salem, Frank O'Brien immediately went to the hospital to be with his friend. Malott is gone now. At least he doesn't talk anymore. But we think Malott's gone now because suddenly Frank O'Brien isn't in the hospital anymore. Sometimes he is, but he's all over the ship now. It was almost like he was stuck in the hospital when Malott was there. And now Malott's gone, and we talked to Frank all over the ship, in the CPO mess, which is very active, in the third mess, which is very active. We talked to him all over the ship. I'm reaching backwards, and I'm hitting the wrong buttons because I'm going the wrong direction. The two guys on top of the right side of the board, Bill Austin and Curtis Cochran, are two guys that died aboard Salem. Bill Austin is another great example of how we get to where we are, and that is that for the longest time, there had been a story about a guy killed in number 3 turret, which is the 8-inch gun turret back aft. We never talked about it because we didn't know it was true. It was just a story people talked about. 2 years ago, a woman whose dad served aboard Salem donated this huge stack of letters that he wrote home. And we went through every single one of them, scanned them, and went through every single one of them. And sure enough, there was a letter from 1958 where he talked about a young kid named Austin who had been hurt badly, bad head injury and 3 turret. They had been working on him all day, and they didn't think he was going to make it. So now we go back to the books again, and we find gunner's mate seaman Bill Austin, who was what they call a striker in the Navy. He wasn't really a gunner's mate. He was just a seaman, but he was training to be a gunner's mate. And sure enough, Bill Austin was killed in number 3 turret. He was down in the gun, what they call the gun pit, and those big guns are like a seesaw. And when they raised the gun, he was down in the pit. And he was hurt badly, and he didn't make it. He did die aboard Salem, in the surgery, actually. Curtis Cochran is another guy who died aboard the ship. He died in a fall in the helicopter hangar. We had known Curtis Cochran for years. We had known him as the peaker. Because for years and years, if you were standing mostly back aft on the port side, looking forward, you would see somebody peek around a hatch cover. So we had known this guy as the peaker for years and years and years. Once we started talking to Bill Austin and Francis Faherty, who was a first-class hospital corpsman, they identified Curtis Cochran. They told us who the peaker was. Faherty was a first-class corpsman aboard the ship in 58. He worked on those two guys. And they're back in the third mess. There's a triage table back there, and he worked on both of those guys on that triage table. So this is the kind of stuff, as I said, I'm going to tell you right now that while there are 1,000 groups like mine with respect to my peers, I don't think anybody in the country is doing what we're doing. I don't think anybody's doing the kind of research we're doing. And I don't think anybody's having the kind of conversations with these entities that we're having. So I talked about the chief, and I told you about him. He is the guardian. We had some YouTube guys aboard, a guy by the name of Elton Castee, and they're crazy. Nice guys, but they're all crazy people. And the first time they came aboard, one of Elton's guys started climbing the 8-inch gun turrets up forward. And when he got back down, he had this huge gash over his eye. And Elton said, "What happened to you?" He said, "I don't know. I was just climbing." And he said, "I think I smashed my own face against the gun." And of course, I was down below saying, "That's not what happened at all. You definitely had help." That was the chief. Those guys were aboard the ship all that night. They talked about being pushed. One guy said if he hadn't had a good enough hold, he'd have gone down a ladder when he was pushed. Some of them got scratched. One of them said he got bitten. They were running around like crazy people. The chief hates Halloween. They broke into a room back aft where there were a bunch of old Halloween props and started running around the ship with Halloween stuff. And the chief just flipped. As they were leaving, one of them turned around and took a picture of the ship from the pier. And this is the picture he took. That shadow in that picture has got to be 10 feet tall. The following weekend, we spent a whole night trying to take this picture. Stood at different places on the pier. We stacked stuff up and tried to stand on it to get high enough, and we couldn't do it. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm convinced this is the chief making sure those sons of bitches were leaving his ship. That's what I think this picture is. I mean, it's pretty clearly a shadow. And there is no way that could have been a person. There's just no way. So I want to show you a video. Unfortunately, the audio isn't great. The chief, who used to be back in the third mess back aft, is now up forward in a room called the wardroom galley. The wardroom on the ship is where the officers ate and had meetings and stuff. And of course, being the officers, they had to have their own kitchen. So the galley is right by the wardroom. I think the chief moved up there because that's kind of where the action is. That's kind of where we call home base when we're aboard. And I think he liked to see what was going on when we were up there. So this video takes place in that room. We're talking to the chief because that was the day I lost Jim Duffy. And we had been talking about whether these entities knew what was going on in our minds, like whether they could read our minds. So we talked to him about that. But we also talked to him about losing Duff and things like that. The reason I like this video, and I cut it, it's pretty long, but I cut it so it's very short. You're going to see a REM pod and a Paralight on the table, and you're going to see them going off in response to questions. You're going to have a guest and one of my team out in the hallway who have a personal experience or a feeling. There's a motion sensor out in the passageway that's going to go off. And when I talk about personal experiences, what happens is these two women both say they got headaches in kind of in unison, and then the motion sensor goes off. What we think happened is the entity walked by them on the way out. They felt him as they were leaving, and then he went down the passageway in the other direction. Hey. Paralight, REM pod in the back. I only ask about his rank because Duff was a cook like the chief. Oh, thank you. Like I said, that paralight's not very sensitive at all. When it spikes like that, there's something going on. You hear him he's talking to the chief, but he's talking to him about talking to Petty Officer O'Brien in the hospital. He's talking about Michelle playing with Lucy back in the third mess. There's the motion sensor. We're running out of time, so I'm going to bail here. But as you can see, this is, as I said, these instruments go off, and there's a lot of things that can make them go off. But you look at the timing, and you look at the fact that they're going off in response to questions, and you notice that we're not all that excited about it because it's something that happens every weekend for us. It turns out whoever left was somebody we didn't even know. So there you go. So, I talk about the dowsing rods. Um, what's great when it happens is when the old school and the electronic stuff goes off at the same time. And this is a conversation. We're sitting in the CPO mess, and I'm using my dowsing rods, and I'm talking to Duff. Sorry. Duff had been struggling with the instruments. He was new, and he was still learning how to use them, I think. but you can hear them going off in conjunction or in unison with the sticks. That's not even in the room. That's out in the hallway. So, as I said, these are the cat balls. This is the hospital. One of the reasons I'm fortunate in that other people give me evidence is that I always make sure to give them credit for it. One of the great things about being an advocate for the ship as opposed to an advocate for myself is that I don't care who took the video. It's evidence from the ship, and that's good enough for me. So I always make sure to point out that this video on the left is from an unbelievable group of deaf ghost hunters. They're called Silence Paranormal. I don't even know how they do what they do, but they're really good. And the video on the right is from, of all the groups that are ghost hunters, my favorite name of a group is Schrodinger's Ghost. And that's who took this video on the right. I love that one because it kind of starts rocking a little bit before it falls off the bed. The other one's a little bit harder because you're looking at a bunk, but you're looking at it kind of straight up. You see the bottom of the pillow. And what you see is a tray. For somebody who's in the bunk, they've got that tray. So a lot of times, it's just audio. There's no video. These aren't videos. These are a picture I stuck on the audio. But the first one is what I call the old standard. Every ghost hunter who's ever collected any audio of any value has something similar to this. Did you hear it? It's hard standing back here. This one, this is not the ship's surgery. It's the preparation room, the dressing room. But we were alone aboard the ship, three of us, another guy and a woman. It was before a Halloween thing, and we were trying to capture evidence to play for the guests when they came to the ship for Halloween. And we're standing outside the surgery. Now, the surgery has this plexiglass screwed to the door. I think because, as you can see, there's a lot of little stuff in there, so they don't want guests really going in and out of there. There's a door in the back that I have a key to that gets us in that way. But this particular night, I didn't have my keys. So the other two were arguing about who was going to climb over the plexiglass and all this foolishness. And I kept telling them I could jimmy the door if they'd be patient. But at one point, the woman started saying that she was going to get in there. She was going to get up on the table. She was going to put her feet in the stirrups, and she was going to record to see what happened. And when we played back that conversation, not her in there, but that conversation, This is what we got. It's very fast, but if you listen to it, it's very clear. Did you hear? You didn't hear? Right here. So you heard the voice. I'm going to play it again. I think what she says is, but how would you get there? I think she was reminding us that we hadn't figured out how we were going to get in the room yet. So a lot of times it's just still photographs. This is something a woman took that during the Halloween event. Actually, she was leaving the ship and turned around and took that. I thought was kind of interesting. This is more interesting. That's the surgery. We were in the office, my office, and Sandra said, "There's a woman crying in the surgery." And being around these psychics is exhausting because it's always something. And I have to admit I wasn't very quick to get off my butt and go see what was going on. But eventually I heard something. So we went down the hall and I took this picture. And what I love about this picture is not only does it look as though there's somebody laying on the surgical table, but it looks to me like there are people standing around the table. Whether they're watching or they're doctors or what the hell they are, I don't know. But that's what it looks like to me. This is my favorite. This woman in orange, and this is in the hospital, and they're on he's on the first bunk. She's in a chair, and I'm about 3 beds down. And she kept saying, "There's somebody behind me. I know there's somebody behind me." And then this kid said, "Hey, somebody just banged into my shoulder." So I just leaned out and took a picture with my phone. If you look at this closely, there's nobody standing between those two people. This guy is not there. When I took the picture, I didn't see him. And he's so solid, what you see behind him is a water bubbler. And his shoulder's blocking it out. But I promise you, there was nobody there. This is a once in a lifetime catch. I think this is Frank O'Brien. This was in the hospital, and I think you're looking at Frank O'Brien. If you take a card and you look at our social media stuff, you'll be able to get a much better look at this picture. I think he's wearing a pea coat and a watch cap, myself. But take a look at it yourself and tell me what you think later. So the last thing I want to show you is, I don't know if anybody ever saw the movie The Conjuring. It was pretty big. I mean, there's been 4 of them now. The original movie The Conjuring was about a family named Perrin who lived in a house in Harrisville, Rhode Island. And we've spent the night in that house a couple of times. And the second oldest daughter, Andrea Perrin, is a pretty good friend of ours. And Andrea is out there. Like when the guy first used the expression "out there," he was talking about Andrea. She's a wonderful, wonderful woman, but she is gonzo. She's left ghosts in the rearview mirror, and she now deals exclusively with extraterrestrials. And I don't mean she sees UFOs. I mean she travels with them and all this other stuff. Like I say, I love her, but she's out there. So she came to the ship last summer, and what I didn't know is right before she got there, she had hurt her hip, and she wasn't able to go down the ladders. And she said, "Oh, there's just as much going on up here as there is down there, so don't worry about me." And I said, "Okay." And down I went. And then later she sent me these pictures. you see the three dots at first, right? And they're kind of all over the place. Then you see them here, and it's a triangle with this kind of line between them. And I hate to date myself, but when the shipyard was open in the early 80s, I worked in that building. Anyway, she sent me this picture, and you look at it, and now you see the same three dots, but they're moving around now. Still in the triangle, still with this line here, and you can see this is the same picture. I mean, you see the woman in both pictures. But these things are moving around. Andrea says she wants to come back. We did on our Halloween event this year, we had a Skywatch event that was hugely successful. We think we're going to do a couple of them next year, just those things, because people loved it. And they came back with all kinds of stuff that they saw going on in the sky over the ship. So that just kind of shows you that it's not just down below, it's up above. The Salem is someplace that if you ever have the opportunity, if you're ever in the eastern part of the state, she's open on weekends anyway, during the spring and summer. She closes from Thanksgiving weekend to the first week in April. Other than that, she's open. She's a great take. She is not just the ship. She's the United States Naval Shipbuilding Museum. The whole below decks where all the ship's berthing crew slept are all museum spaces now for the most part. And it's a great take for a Saturday or Sunday afternoon. It's not too difficult to get around. And it's a great take. So I highly suggest it's a good take, especially if you have any appreciation for the Navy or the military. There's some great SEAL exhibits and some great shipbuilding exhibits. The Florida Shipyard, in case you didn't know, during World War II, more military ships were built there than any other single location on Earth. It's a massive place. It closed in 1986, but it is a massive location. And the Salem is located about 75 yards from where her keel was laid. So she is, in a sense, home. And it would be a great take. So that's all I got. I think we're done. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. I appreciate you coming. If anybody has any questions, I would be happy.
When you were talking to your children, Greek and Italian, what language did they
Yeah, you know, I'll tell you, we one of the things we learned a long time ago was that the language barrier kind of goes away. You know, we've had experiences where we've spoken to other people that are from other countries, and we've never had any difficulty speaking to them. It's kind of interesting. They speak to each other, I assume, in their own language. But when they communicate with us, you know, whether they're speaking Greek or Italian and we're hearing it in English, I don't know the answer to that question. But we've never had any problems.
But you're asking them questions
In English, absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, now that you say it, they could be responding in Italian, for all we know. The instruments are going. But who knows whether, you know what I'm saying? The instruments aren't, you know, I'm sure they don't recognize it, English or Italian or Greek or whatever. That's one of the things we've learned about them talking to each other too. We had an experience in the hospital the end of last season where Duff and Laz were in the hospital together. And Lou and I were talking to them, and I said, "So Laz, do you know Duff?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "So you must know what ship Duff and I served on together." And he said, "No." So Lou said, "Well, Duff, can you just tell him?" And Duff said, "Yes." So I don't know what happened. We moved on to something else. And about 15 minutes later, I said, "Laz, you still here?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "So do you know what ship Duff and I served on together?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "You do?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Duff told you?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "So you know, Duff and I served aboard USS Lafayette together?" And he said, "No." And I said, "No, you caught me." I said, "We served aboard Tecumseh." And he said, "No." And I said, "Hey, you got me again. We served aboard James Madison." And he said, "Yes." That's a great piece of audio too, because you hear that, and then either Lou or I, we argue over who it was, you hear say, "Holy shit, did that just happen?" So that's one of the things, we're learning about how they communicate with each other. We know the chief and Robert, who I talked about, don't speak. Robert used to be very difficult with women aboard the ship, and the chief has no use for that. So when we're talking to them in the CPO mess, they're at opposite ends of the table. Robert says he would like to fix it, and the chief doesn't want any part of it. He says because the way Robert treats women, he doesn't want anything to do with them, and nothing's going to change that. Well, I mean, like I said, they're people, and it would be much better for us if they would talk, obviously. But I mean, if they're not going to do it, they're not going to do it, right?
I just had the question about who do you have permission from that you can be on the ship?
Well, the ship is owned by, well, it's owned by the Navy, and it's leased by a group called the USS Salem Association. And the executive director of the ship is the one who gave us our mandate. So like I said, about 15 years, and I was persona non grata for maybe a year or so. Well, the old executive director, I used to say that he lacked vision. We would beg and plead somebody to come. Groups like mine pay $1,000 to be on the ship from 6:30 p.m. to 1 a.m. on a Saturday night. And back in the day, they used to pay $350. We would have to beg people to come because the ship had such a bad reputation. And the reason they would have a reputation was that I would beg and plead, get a group to come, and then he would book like a party on the fantail, so that the ghost group couldn't do their thing while music was playing. You had people traipsing through the ship. They'd be back aft, the party. The only public bathrooms are up forward. So these people would be traipsing through the ship to go to the bathrooms. And I would say to him, you got to stop. You can't do this. And he would say, what do you care? You got the money. We got the money from somebody who's going to badmouth us to everybody they meet and who will never come back. So that guy, and I used to tell him, we could make this place into Ghost City, USA, if you would just get out of the way. So he left, and I just by pure chance bumped into the new executive director in the parking lot one day. I think I was packing up my office. Oh no, we didn't even have an office. I think I was packing up my stuff from a closet or something. And she said, "You're Don." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "We need to talk." And I'm going to tell you right now that we've been on the ship for my gang for about 4 years now. We've made the ship, as an estimate, we've made the ship about $200,000 over that period of time. When you buy tickets to our events on the ship, you buy them through the ship's website. We don't see a nickel of that money. Everything goes to the ship. I mean, it's important to us. This is a labor of love for us. So we've made, I bet you more than that. I bet you close to $250,000 over the last 4 years for the ship. I mean, a public investigation, we have one tonight. We can't schedule them fast enough. You're talking about 30 guests at $50 a pop. We do those probably twice a month. And the other Saturdays, we have groups, like I said, paying $1,000 to spend, 6 hours on the ship. And it is right now the most actively haunted place in New England. There's no question about that.